I thought I was finally alone, enjoying a peaceful night, but the moment I heard the creak of the door, my heart froze. It wasn't my husband, it was Nathan, my stepson. He shouldn't have been here. What was he running from? The way he looked at me, the tension in his voice, it wasn't normal. And then he said something that changed everything. Nathan was my husband Carl's son from his first marriage. When Carl and I got married, Nathan was already a teenager, confident, distant, and a little guarded. We had always been polite with each other, but it wasn't the kind of bond that comes naturally. Carl, a traveling businessman, was often away, leaving the two of us to navigate the unspoken distance. Our home was my sanctuary, a place of peace when Carl was gone. I had a routine I cherished, quiet nights with my favorite book, lavender-scented baths, and the soft hum of an old air conditioner breaking the silence. On this particular evening, with the Texas sunset painting the horizon in oranges and purples, I thought I could finally relax. Wrapped in a robe, a glass of wine by my bedside, I felt a rare sense of tranquility. Nathan, now in his early 20s, was away at college. Or at least, that's where he was supposed to be. We barely spoke unless Carl was around, and while we had no ill feelings, our relationship remained formal. I didn't expect to see him again until Thanksgiving. That's why, when I heard the front door open, my entire body stiffened. Carl wasn't due back for days, and Nathan had no reason to be here. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. When he appeared in my doorway, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his expression was heavy, something deeper than stress etched into his face. "I needed a break," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. There was something raw in his tone, an unspoken pain that he wasn't ready to share. I couldn't deny the sudden tension in the room. It wasn't like before, it felt heavier. As I pointed him toward the guest room, I couldn't help but notice the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was rare for Nathan to let his guard down, and even rarer for me to feel anything beyond polite indifference. But that night something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just Carl's wife or Nathan's stepmother. I was the only one who could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed walls. And it scared me. The first night after Nathan's unexpected arrival, I told myself his return was just a coincidence, a temporary break from college stress. But the longer he stayed, the more I noticed the subtle shifts, the way his presence disrupted the quiet balance I had created. It wasn't anything overt, just small, almost imperceptible changes that tugged at the edges of my mind. Nathan had always been self-assured, with an air of confidence that bordered on aloofness. But now, that confidence seemed to falter. He was restless, pacing the house late into the night. I'd catch glimpses of him in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, or in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his head down. He looked lost. And while I wanted to dismiss it as a normal part of growing up, there was something in his eyes, a quiet desperation that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just his behavior that unsettled me. It was the way he started to linger. He'd find reasons to be nearby, casually entering the room I was in with flimsy excuses. "Do you know where the extra towels are?" he'd ask, even though he'd been in the house long enough to know. Or, "I think the Wi-Fi's acting up again," even when I knew it wasn't. His tone was light, but there was something else underneath, a tension I couldn't quite place. The way he looked at me started to change, too. It wasn't obvious at first, just a moment here, a glance that lingered a second too long. But as the days passed, those moments grew more frequent, more intense. It wasn't the kind of gaze you'd expect from a stepson. It felt weighted, searching, as if he was trying to decipher something in me that even I didn't understand. One night, as I sat on the couch reading, Nathan came in and sat on the other end, unusually quiet. I glanced up and saw him watching me. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "You seem different," he said softly. His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Different how?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. He shrugged, looking away. "I don't know. Just different." That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. Was it guilt? Concern? Or was it something else entirely? I replayed every interaction we'd had, searching for answers. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. All I knew was that the air between us had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing just beneath the surface. The next morning, I tried to re-establish the boundaries that seemed to be blurring. I avoided being alone with Nathan, keeping myself busy with chores or staying in my room. But it didn't help. If anything, the tension only grew. Every time I turned around, he was there, silent, watching, waiting. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down I knew better. The breaking point came that evening. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I felt him behind me. I turned to find him standing there, closer than I expected. "Do you need something?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets. "No," he said finally, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something he wasn't saying, something he couldn't bring himself to admit. And then, as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Lara," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to brush them off, to tell myself they didn't mean what they sounded like. But deep down I knew they did. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of vulnerability from Nathan, a young man grappling with the weight of his struggles. But the atmosphere between us continued to shift, becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. The walls of our home felt smaller, and the boundaries I thought were clear began to blur in ways I couldn't explain. It started with the small, innocuous moments. Nathan's glances lingered longer, his voice softened when he spoke to me, and his presence filled every corner of the house. He began seeking me out more deliberately, finding excuses to spend time near me. Whether it was helping me clean up after dinner or sitting across from me in the living room as I read, his attention was undeniable. One evening, I was curled up on the couch with a book, the warm glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. Nathan entered, his movements hesitant. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, forcing a casual smile. "Of course." He settled on the opposite end of the couch, the space between us feeling far more intimate than it should have. For a while, he said nothing, simply watching the flicker of the television in the background. Then he spoke, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night," he began, his tone careful. I looked up, my heart quickening. "Nathan, you don't have to," he interrupted gently, shaking his head. "No, I do. I feel like I need to say it." His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "You're the only person who makes me feel like I matter. Like I'm not just lost." The vulnerability in his words cut through me, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Nathan, you're going through a lot right now," I said carefully. "It's normal to feel this way, but—" He leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "It's not just that. It's you. You've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. You see me in a way no one else does." I froze, my thoughts spiraling. His words felt dangerously close to something I couldn't allow myself to acknowledge. "Nathan, I'm your stepmother," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "What you're feeling, it's just confusion. You're projecting." He shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. "It's not confusion," he insisted. "It's real." The air between us grew heavier, the silence charged with unspoken emotions. I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us. "This conversation is over," I said, my voice trembling. But as I turned to leave, Nathan stood too, closing the space between us. "Please, Lara," he said softly, his voice filled with desperation. "Don't walk away." I hesitated, my breath hitching as I felt the heat of his presence behind me. "Nathan, this isn't right," I whispered, barely able to trust my own voice. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, a touch so fleeting, yet it sent a shiver through me. "It feels right," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. His eyes searched mine, filled with an intensity that left me breathless. "Nathan, you don't know what you're saying," I said, though even I wasn't sure I believed my own words. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I've never been more sure of anything." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of his confession hung between us, suffocating and electric all at once. I wanted to step away, to rebuild the walls that had been crumbling for days. But something in his expression held me there, raw, vulnerable, and completely unguarded. "I care about you," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But not like this. I can't." The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to maintain control. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Can't or won't?" he asked, his tone a mix of defiance and pain. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too dangerous, too tangled in the emotions I had been trying so hard to suppress. "Nathan," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He reached out again, his hand grazing mine. "Lara," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Just tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll stop. I'll leave. Just say the word." The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. My chest tightened as I fought to find the strength to speak, to tell him what I knew I should say. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the pull, the undeniable, forbidden connection that had been building between us. Before I could stop myself, I stepped back, creating the space I so desperately needed. "This has to end," I said, my voice firm but laced with a trembling I couldn't hide. Nathan's expression shifted, a mix of resignation and sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "I didn't mean to make things harder." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the living room. But even as I sat down, my hands trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably changed. The line between us had been crossed, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be redrawn. The night was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and whisper in the house. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed door, willing myself to forget the weight of the last few days. But forgetting wasn't possible. Nathan's words echoed in my mind, replaying like a broken record. "You're the only thing that feels real." I had hoped that after our conversation, things would return to normal. That Nathan would retreat into his room, and we'd both quietly pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. There was no going back now. It was past midnight when I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, my breath hitching in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that Nathan was probably just heading to the kitchen for water. But then the sound stopped, just outside my door. "Lara!" His voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond, hoping he would take the silence as a sign to leave. But instead, the door creaked open slightly, and there he was, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway light. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Can I come in?" I should have said no. I should have told him to go back to his room, to leave me alone. But instead I nodded, my voice betraying me with a soft, "Okay." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He lingered by the door for a moment, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants. His expression was unreadable, a mix of hesitation and something deeper that I couldn't quite place. "What's wrong, Nathan?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the chair by the window, sitting down and leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I can't stop thinking about what I said," he admitted finally, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And about how you didn't deny it." I froze, my heart racing. "Deny what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That there's something between us," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You felt it too, didn't you?" The room seemed to spin, his words cutting through the fragile defenses I had been clinging to. "Nathan, it's not right," I said, my voice trembling. "You're confused, and I'm not confused," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "For once, I'm not confused about anything. I know what I feel, and I know you feel it too. Why can't you just admit it?" His words hung in the air, charged with a tension that made it impossible to breathe. I stood abruptly, needing to create distance between us. "You're my stepson," I said firmly, my voice shaking. "Whatever you think is happening, it's not. It can't." He stood too, his movements slow and deliberate. "You keep saying it can't, but you don't say it's not real," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Why, Lara? Why can't you just tell me the truth?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was too dangerous, too tangled in the emotions I had been trying so hard to suppress. Instead, I turned away, my hands trembling at my sides. "You need to leave," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "Please, Nathan, go back to your room." But he didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Look me in the eye and tell me you feel nothing," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "If you can do that, I'll leave. I won't bother you again." I froze, my chest tightening as his words sank in. I couldn't look at him, couldn't meet his gaze. Because the truth was, I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, he closed the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, a touch so light it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. It lingered, the heat of his skin sending a shiver through me. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice cracking. "This has to stop." But he didn't step back. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice a murmur that sent my heart racing. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said again. "Tell me and I'll stop." I turned to face him, my breath hitching as our eyes met. The intensity in his gaze was undeniable, a mixture of longing and vulnerability that left me frozen. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us in the charged silence of the room. But then, like a flash of lightning cutting through the darkness, a noise outside shattered the moment. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. Carl was home. Nathan stepped back abruptly, his expression shifting to one of panic. "I didn't think he'd be back tonight," he muttered, his voice laced with tension. "Neither did I whispered, my mind racing. "You need to go. Now." He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine as if he wanted to say something more. But then he nodded, turning and slipping out of the room just as the front door opened. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, as I heard Carl's footsteps in the hallway. The weight of what had just happened, what could have happened, settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to steady my breathing, to compose myself before Carl walked through the door. When he did, his expression was warm, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. "Hey, honey," he said, his voice tired but cheerful. "I'm home." I forced a smile, the tension in my body hidden beneath a facade of normalcy. "Welcome back," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. But even as I hugged him, as I listened to him talk about his trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The fragile balance of our lives had been shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The days after Carl's return were a blur of forced normalcy. I went through the motions, cooking meals, folding laundry, making small talk, but the weight of what had happened with Nathan lingered like a shadow I couldn't escape. Every time I caught his eye across the table or heard his footsteps echo down the hall, my chest tightened. Nathan, for his part, seemed distant. He no longer sought me out, no longer lingered in doorways or found excuses to stay close. He avoided being alone with me entirely, retreating to his room or disappearing for hours at a time. I told myself this was for the best, that the distance would help us both regain control. But deep down, I felt the absence of his presence more than I cared to admit. Carl, blissfully unaware, carried on as if nothing was wrong. He spent his evenings recounting stories from his trip, his laughter filling the house with a warmth I couldn't fully absorb. But every time he mentioned Nathan, how proud he was of his son, how he couldn't wait for him to finish school, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made my stomach churn. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Carl suggested we have a family dinner. "We haven't all sat down together in a while," he said, his tone cheerful. "It'll be good for us." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." Nathan didn't argue when Carl called him downstairs, but his expression was tight, his movements stiff as he took his seat at the table. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that made even the clinking of silverware sound deafening. I avoided Nathan's gaze, focusing on Carl's animated conversation about a potential business deal. But I could feel Nathan's eyes on me, the weight of his stare impossible to ignore. At one point, Carl got up to grab another bottle of wine from the kitchen. The moment he was out of the room, the air between Nathan and me shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and laced with frustration. "How long are we going to pretend like nothing happened?" My fork froze midair, my pulse quickening. "Nathan, not now," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "When then?" he pressed, his tone sharp. "Because I can't keep doing this." I shot him a warning look, glancing toward the kitchen door. "Please stop," I hissed, my chest tightening. "Carl will hear you." Nathan sat back, his jaw tightening as he exhaled sharply through his nose. When Carl returned, oblivious to the charged moment he had just interrupted, I plastered on a smile and changed the subject. But the tension lingered, crackling beneath the surface like a live wire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Carl snored softly beside me. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. How had things spiraled so far out of control? And more importantly, how was I going to fix it? I decided I couldn't avoid Nathan forever. The next morning, while Carl was out running errands, I knocked on Nathan's bedroom door. He opened it after a moment, his expression guarded. "Can we talk?" I asked. He stepped aside, letting me in. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. I stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of how to start. "Nathan, about the other night," I began, my voice trailing off. "What about it?" he asked, his tone clipped. "You've been pretending it didn't happen ever since." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Because it shouldn't have happened. None of it should have." He crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. "You keep saying that, but you still haven't told me it meant nothing." I looked away, my chest tightening. Because it's complicated, I admitted finally. I care about you, Nathan, but not in the way you think. This whatever you're feeling, it's not real. Not real, he repeated, his voice rising. It's the only thing that's felt real in months. You can lie to yourself if you want, but don't lie to me. His words cut deep, but I forced myself to stay calm. You're young, I said softly. You're going through a lot, and it's easy to confuse those feelings for something they're not. He shook his head, frustration etched into his features. You don't get it, he said. I don't feel this way because I'm young or confused. I feel this way because of you. Because you see me when no one else does. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. Nathan, you need to let this go, I said firmly. For both our sakes. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze searching mine. Then he exhaled, his shoulders slumping. If that's what you want, he said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. It is, I said, though my voice wavered. We need to move past this. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Fine, he said. But don't expect me to forget. I left his room feeling both relief and an ache I couldn't explain. I had drawn the line, made it clear where we stood. But the weight of his words lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was truly resolved. Over the next few days, Nathan kept his distance, barely speaking to me unless Carl was around. I told myself this was a good thing, that it meant we were both moving on. But every time I passed his closed door, a part of me wondered if I had really done the right thing, or if I had only delayed the inevitable. The tension in the house eventually settled into an uneasy calm. Nathan retreated into his own world, spending most of his time in his room or out of the house entirely. Carl, as oblivious as ever, assumed Nathan's silence was due to stress from school. I didn't correct him. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous to share. I poured myself into distractions, cleaning, errands, and endless work projects. Anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. But even as I tried to bury the memories of that night and the days that followed, they lingered, haunting the quiet moments when I least expected it. I replayed every word Nathan had said, every glance, every touch, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. One evening, as Carl and I sat on the couch watching television, I glanced toward the staircase, half expecting Nathan to appear. But he didn't. It had been weeks since he'd sought me out, and though I told myself this was for the best, a part of me ached at the distance between us. Not because I missed the tension, but because I missed the person he had been before all of this, the confident, self-assured young man who barely needed my attention. The turning point came a few days later, when Nathan announced he was heading back to college. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his bag slung over his shoulder, his expression distant. I've got to get back, he said simply. Classes are starting soon. Carl clapped him on the back, beaming with pride. That's my boy, he said, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. You're going to do great things, son. Nathan's eyes flickered to mine briefly, a silent exchange passing between us. I nodded, forcing a small smile. Take care of yourself, Nathan, I said softly. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded and turned to leave. The sound of the door closing behind him felt heavier than it should have, final in a way that made my chest tighten. The house felt emptier after he left, the silence more oppressive. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I started to reflect on everything that had happened, not just the tension with Nathan, but my own role in letting it escalate. I had been so caught up in my loneliness, in my need for validation, that I hadn't seen the lines blurring until it was almost too late. It wasn't just Nathan who had been lost. I had been lost too, searching for meaning in a life that had started to feel routine and stagnant. Carl's frequent absences had left a void I hadn't acknowledged, and I had let that void pull me into dangerous territory. But acknowledging the truth was the first step toward moving forward. I resolved to make changes, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of the family I had almost jeopardized. I started being more honest with Carl, opening up about my feelings instead of brushing them aside. I encouraged him to spend more time at home, to prioritize us over work. And slowly, piece by piece, the life I had built began to feel stable again. As for Nathan, we didn't speak for months. The distance was painful, but it was necessary. When he finally returned home for the holidays, things were different. He was polite but distant, careful not to linger too long in the same room as me. And though the ache of what we had gone through still lingered, I could see that he was healing too. The spark of confidence in his eyes had returned, and he seemed more at ease in his own skin. In time, the tension between us faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of us dared to put into words. We had crossed a line, and though we could never erase what had happened, we could learn from it. Nathan found his footing again, focusing on school and building a life for himself. And I found mine, repairing the cracks in my marriage and rediscovering the person I wanted to be. Looking back, I knew the experience had left a scar, a reminder of the dangers of blurred boundaries and unspoken desires. But it had also taught me the importance of self-awareness, of recognizing the cracks before they widened into chasms. In the end, life moved on. The storm passed, leaving us both changed but stronger for it. And though the shadows of that time lingered, they served as a constant reminder of the lines we should never cross again. If you were in her position, how would you have handled it? Could you have drawn the line sooner? Or would you have been swept up in the storm? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more shocking stories that will leave you questioning everything. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. It's even more unbelievable.